So many beautiful girls made their way through the factory between the years of 1962 and 1968 when it was open. But no one was tougher than Mary Woronov. In fact, Mary herself said, "Of all the girls at the factory, I was the butch one. Andy Warhol put me in his screen test and I spent my nights hanging out at Max's Kansas City. I was the strong girl at the factory." And that's totally true. Mary Woronov was one tough girl. And she, unlike the other superstars, she was not fragile. She was not delicate. She was beautiful for sure, but she didn't give a shit, honestly. She didn't care about being famous. She didn't really care about, anything, honestly, except for getting her hands on drugs. And this all escalated for Mary, like everything at the factory. Everything at the factory escalated into disaster. And for Mary personally, it actually escalated to attempted murder. But before we get into all that, hi. My name is Kate Name, and I am the creator of The Factory, which is an immersive show about Andy Warhol's factory and the events that led to his attempted assassination by Valerie Solanas. The concept is simple. Basically, you as the audience are invited to a party at the factory where you can help silkscreen paintings, you can sit for your own screen test, you can help be in an underground movie, you can rock out with a band, and you can potentially try and get in with Andy and become one of his next superstars. It's a really fun, wild, crazy show, and I've been working on it for a number of years. I'm an independent producer, writer, performer living in Brooklyn, and I'm planning to produce this show at $3 Bill in Brooklyn in 2025. But as an independent producer, I need your help. I am trying to get funding right now, among other things, and the best way for you to support me in getting this show into the real world is to subscribe. It would mean so much to me. I am currently less than 100 subscribers away from hitting 1,000 subscribers, which would be huge for me. I would be very excited. Also, just like the video, leave a comment. If you are interested at all in this project, think it's cool, let me know. That helps, honestly. So anyways, with all that being said, let's start talking about Mary Woronov. So Mary Woronov was born in a hotel in Palm Beach, Florida, while this hotel was actually being used as a hospital during World War II. It was kind of repurposed as a makeshift hospital. She is born very prematurely. In fact, she's born so prematurely that she still has long black prenatal hair covering her whole body. And she also has a spinal tumor that resembles a tail. So she looks, as a baby, kind of monstrous. And she actually, in her book Swimming Underground, which is a memoir about her time at the factory, she writes that every time the doctors rolled her out to see her family, her grandma would scream at the sight of her and tell the nurses to send her back. So that's a fun start to life. She does not know her father as well. Her mom was a single mom. And as a young girl, her and her mom relocate to Brooklyn. And her mom marries this guy, Victor Woronov, who was a cancer surgeon. And they settle in Brooklyn, and Mr. Woronov adopts Mary as his own child. So her stepdad is this cancer surgeon, and their home life, it wasn't the worst that we've talked about, certainly on this channel. Of these factory people, there are other people that had a rougher time growing up. But it still wasn't really fabulous. Her stepdad cheats on her mom all the time, and her mom is kind of depressed and kind of a hoarder. She talks about piles of stuff all around their house that are continuously moved. And I think at the time in the 60s, the term hoarder, I don't know if it existed. I could be wrong on that, but it was kind of her mother's mental illness was somewhat mysterious to her. And her father, being a surgeon, has access to medicine. Now, her parents are pretty conservative, and they would beat her if they ever found out that she was smoking weed. But pills are medicine. Pills are not drugs in their eyes. And this is the 50s when mother's little helpers were used quite a bit, and that is just another word for speed. Speed was used to give people a pep, and it was used it was prescribed everywhere. So because her stepdad is a doctor and has access to medicine, Mary's mother is prescribed amphetamines to just give her a little help throughout the day. And Mary gets introduced to these pills really, really young while she's still a teenager. Now, in fall of 1962, Mary Woronov enrolls at Cornell University as an art student. At the same time that Mary is enrolling in Cornell University and starting her art program, Andy Warhol is just signing the lease on this new industrial space in Midtown Manhattan that will become the factory. Now, we're gonna take a quick little side detour and talk about the mole people, because the mole people are a huge, huge part of this factory story that I feel like nobody ever talks about, but they're very, very important. Now, if you've been watching my videos, you will have heard some of these stories before, and I kind of wanted to point out, a friend of mine, shout out to my friend Mike, was also watching these videos, and he pointed out that as I've been making these videos, I'm covering kind of like similar topics. You're hearing about the same events, but through the eyes of different people, and that's kind of how my show works. My show is an hour long, but it loops. And the idea is there's so much packed into that hour. There's 12 characters, there's so much happening that there's no way you could see everything that happens in the show one time through. So when you come to the factory, my version of the factory, the show happens twice. It's an hour-long show that loops. So every performance is 2 hours in total. And the idea is that you get the opportunity to see the same story from a different perspective. And it kind of like begs the question, like, how much does perspective influence our interpretation of events? Because from Andy's perspective, he might think one thing, but from Valerie's perspective, she thinks something completely different. So as you're watching these videos, if you start to be like, oh, she's talked about this before, think about it from the person's perspective that I'm talking about this time, because I think that will kind of open your mind to the different possibilities. Okay, I'm rambling, but anyways, so all that to say, the mole people were this group of drugged out, fiercely intelligent, artistic, opera-loving, poetry-loving, drug-loving speed freaks, basically. They were all like varying degrees of homeless, and they were united by a love of amphetamines and a love of opera, oddly enough. And they had a very strong sense of group identity. They took family photos every year, despite like not having homes. They could organize themselves enough to like take a photo every year, which I think is kind of charming. But they basically they would do whatever it was during the day that they needed to do to sustain themselves. And then at night they would have these parties, and the parties would float all over the city depending on where they could find a party, because again, homeless drug addicts. So they were this group of like artists essentially that were just obsessed with taking drugs. And Andy was the leader of this group. We have not really talked about Andy yet in any of these videos, but next week we're going to talk about Andy. But he's important to this story. So Andy was kind of like the hub, the center of this, but there were other important people, namely Billy Name. Billy Name was this like lighting designer who was working with Judson Street Dance and some other dance groups in like the Greenwich Village area. And he was also a jack of all trades. He like was very handy. He could pretty much do anything. And one of his skills that he had was giving haircuts. And right before Andy signed the lease on the factory, Billy had, in a very like amphetamine driven way, covered his whole apartment with tinfoil. Like every surface was covered in tinfoil. So it had this very like spacey vibe. And he was having haircutting parties where people could come to his apartment, take some speed, and he would give them a haircut. So everyone's just like doing drugs and getting a haircut. And these parties would last for like days at a time, because time kind of loses meaning when you're on drugs. And so Andy Warhol had actually come to one of these haircutting parties, and he had seen the silvery space and all these hot people doing drugs and like getting their haircut, and he was like, oh my God, this has to be a movie. And so he had just signed the lease on this new space where him and his assistant Gerard were silk screening paintings. And he was like, Billy, you've got to come to my new studio and you've got to do this like spacey silver thing. And also I think I want to get into movies, and so we should make a movie about people getting their hair cut, just like this. And so they do that. Billy moves into the factory. He lives in the bathroom at the factory, and he starts rewiring it and making it safer for them to work with like the electricity and stuff, because it was like very decrepit, and covering the whole place in tinfoil. So this is what's happening at the factory. And also at the same time, early in the factory, Andy Warhol had started this series called Screen Tests. And screen tests were basically an initiation point for new people at the factory, almost like a baptism, where Andy Warhol had decided that his next project, besides just producing art, the factory was going to produce stars. And so when people would come to the factory, Andy would be like, oh my God, you're so beautiful. I've just started this new project. It's called The 13 Most Beautiful Boys and the 13 Most Beautiful Girls. And I think you should be one of my most 13 beautiful boys or 13 beautiful girls, depending on the person. And so he would say, you're so beautiful, you must sit for a screen test. And so they would sit for these screen tests, and it would kind of become like their initiation as a star. And sometimes people would take on new names. Like Billy Name was originally Billy Linick. When he became a superstar, he took on Name, which is also where I took my name. So that's what's going on at the factory. So Gerard, who was Andy's hot, hunky assistant, he starts kind of going off on his own and looking for his own superstars. So Gerard, like I said, very hot. And he kind of was like this bait that Andy was using. So Gerard would go out into the world, find a beautiful girl, flirt with this beautiful girl, and be like, hey, you should be a star. You should come back to the factory and we'll do a screen test for you. And so that's kind of what Gerard had been doing. I mean, this wasn't malicious, I don't think, but he was like, you know, he had a lot of girls. So one day, Gerard goes up to Cornell University to meet up with this friend, and it just so happened that this friend was dating Mary Woronov's roommate. And so Gerard and Mary meet for the first time. Freddie Herco was one of the Mole People, and Freddie Herco was a dancer, and he actually starred in Haircut, which is the film that Andy made right after Billy moved into the factory when everything was brand new. And Freddie becomes the first mole person to start showing side effects of massive amphetamine intake. And he notices it because he's a dancer, and so he's more tuned to his body than the average person. And he notices that his ankles start getting weak, he's more jittery, his balance is worse. And then things get worse for him. He starts to kind of retreat into himself. He has a roommate that he's living with in Greenwich Village. And at first he stops going past like the end of this hallway in their apartment. And then he retreats into his room and he stops leaving his room entirely. And then he gets further into himself and he stops leaving his closet. He just puts himself in his closet and won't come out. And his roommate gets very freaked out by this and says, Freddie, you have to leave. I'm scared. And so Freddie leaves his apartment and he's effectively homeless, kind of joining the rest of the Mole People in a homeless state. And a lighting designer named John Dodd sees Freddie dancing wildly on the street in Greenwich Village. And he's very unkempt and he seems kind of manic. And John asks Freddie to come back with him to his apartment to like have a meal and a bath and just like try and get cleaned up. And so Freddie goes to John Dodd's apartment on Cornelia Street, and they are on the 6th floor, and Freddie starts taking a bath. And while he's in the bath, John puts on Mozart's Coronation Mass. And Freddie perks up. As I mentioned, all these Mole People, they love opera. And so when Freddie hears Mozart's Coronation Mass, he gets out of the tub and he starts dancing wildly, completely naked around the room. And he's spinning and spinning and spinning. And as the Coronation Mass hits this peak on the song Sanctus, Freddie leaps out the window to his death. And this shocks the Warhol world and the Mole People and that whole kind of beginning of the factory scene. This is like the first big whoa moment of like, what is going on here? And everyone knew that something was wrong with Freddie, but still this act of like dancing himself to death is very shocking. And what's also shocking is Andy's response to it. Andy, when he hears about Freddie Herco leaping naked out the window to his death, Andy says, oh, if Freddie knew that he was going to kill himself, I wish he would have let me film it. Kind of betraying this like deep lack of empathy and sympathy, and also like showcasing Andy's mentality around what he's doing here and how important like capturing these things on film is, and his attitude towards death and a lot of dark stuff. And so this kind of is shocking, But the factory is just ramping up. That's just the beginning. And so Freddie Hergo is kind of like brushed to the side and things get more exciting at the factory. So around this time is when Mary is just starting her program at Cornell University, and she is experimenting with something that she calls gender slipping, which is basically she's dancing on stage. She goes to these bars and she is dressing like the macho guys that she's actually secretly lusting after. She's not gay, she loves men, but she's very scared of interacting with them. And she says that doing these like macho dances dressed as macho men on these small stages at these bars is exciting to her because, in her words, she says, why bother dancing with one stupid guy when you could dance on stage and have 20 of them? So she's very resistant to actual like intimacy, but she likes the power of dancing in front of these men. And around this time is when Mary meets Gerard. Gerard comes to Cornell University to visit a friend of his, and it just so happens that this friend is dating Mary Woronov's roommate. And Gerard and Mary are instantly drawn to each other. Mary notices that Gerard kind of flaunts this performative femininity in the same way that she is performing masculinity. And so they're kind of this like yin and yang, like opposites attract kind of vibe. And so immediately they just become very close. And Gerard tells Mary that he is friends with Andy Warhol and that he's hanging out at the factory. And Mary is very interested in this. Mary also was very close to getting kicked out of Cornell University because she was not going to class. She was failing her art program. She was getting drunk all the time and doing drugs and like truly just did not care. And so when she finds out about Warhol, she is intrigued. So Mary Woronov ends up visiting the factory with her class from Cornell. They go on a field trip to New York City to see a bunch of different artist studios, and one of them is the factory. And when they show up to the factory, Gerard is there, and he sees Mary, and he's like, Mary, come do a screen test. And so Mary sneaks off, leaves her class, and they film her screen test at the factory, and that's it. That is like, she is done with school. She wants to be here at the factory. And so she drops out of Cornell. Now, Gerard, he has some ulterior motives. I love Gerard, no shade to Gerard, but Gerard really wanted to be a star. And so far, he's kind of just been Andy's assistant. Gerard was getting paid. In fact, he was the only person in the factory that ever got paid. He was making the minimum wage. But because he had an actual job, Andy wasn't really considering him like one of the stars. He was the silkscreen guy. So Gerard really does want to be a star though, and he thinks that maybe if he has a leading lady with him, Andy will take him seriously and he'll put both him and Mary in a movie. And so they kind of become this set, Mary and Gerard, and they film each other a lot. They take a lot of pictures together. He films footage of Mary. Like, they're very enamored with like their image together, but they're not really actually a couple. They're not romantic and they're not really sleeping together or anything like that. And Gerard does not care about this. I mean, like, Gerard had plenty of girls. He was fine. But Mary was kind of like resistant to men. She was not asexual. In fact, she was obsessed with Ondine, but Ondine was gay. So he was not interested in her. But Ondine and Mary become very close friends very quickly, and Ondine is one of the mole people, and so Mary kind of gets in with the mole people, and she's already has an affinity for drugs, and so that just ramps up when she starts hanging out with Ondine. Now, she actually has a very interesting quote that I'm going to read to you about the mole people. She says, "Do not imagine that I scampered around those velvet sewers completely unscathed. You cannot play with shit all night and come out looking like a boarding school virgin. No, no, no. You have some shit in your hair, you have a little on your shoe, and soon you're talking shit. Every time you open your mouth, it just falls out. If you hung out with the mole people, somewhere, somehow, either their drugs or one of their thoughts or just one of their little hairs got into your skin and burrowed deeper and deeper, driving you insane. It was the law, and nobody escaped, not even Andy. The mole people knew this law. They didn't jump out and attack you. They just smiled and waited. Nobody got to leave the playground. Nobody. you only think you're visiting. Very ominous. So this is like fall 1965. And this is also December 1965 is when the Velvet Underground starts practicing at the factory. The factory was basically this free-for-all. It was open 24 hours a day, and Billy Name, being the groundskeeper and being one of the mole people, just starts letting all his friends hang out there because, again, all the mole people were homeless and they had to like move their parties around every night. So when Billy becomes the groundskeeper of this huge studio, suddenly they have a place where they can party. They don't have to move their parties around every night. They have a home base. And so Andy loves this too. He's very quiet himself, but he likes having people around. And so this vibe starts to develop where the factory, because everyone's doing speed, is up 24 hours a day. And they're just working on this art and they're making movies and there's a band rocking out, and it just becomes this like multimedia 24-hour-a-day party. And so the Velvet Underground starts using this space to rehearse, and Andy decides that the Velvet Underground is going to be his new project. You can watch my Velvet Underground video for more Velvet Underground stuff, but a very brief overview is that they were a band that was not well liked. They had a sound that nobody at the time really understood, and they had a look that was scary. And Andy loves all this. Andy likes the dark and the dirt and the bad. And so he's like, this is my new project, but y'all are really scary looking, so we're gonna need to put a beauty with you. And so there's this model named Nico that had been hanging out at the factory, and he's like, you guys are gonna use Nico as your chanteuse, which is basically like the band's, like, what do you call it? You know when like people are dressed up in mascots, there we go. Okay, so she's basically like kind of this mascot for the band, and she plays a tambourine and she sings, but Lou Reed is like, no, I hate this idea. We are the Velvet Underground. We don't need to add anybody. And Andy's like, you have to, I'm insisting. And so they kind of come to a compromise where the band is billed as the Velvet Underground and Nico. If you've ever seen the famous banana print album cover of the Velvet Underground and Nico, that is why it is billed that way, is because basically Lou Reed was like, she's not in the band. And Andy Warhol was like, she is in the band, and this is how they decided to like come to terms with that. So anyways, Nico is singing with the Velvet Underground, and Gerard and Mary start doing these dances. Remember that Mary was already dancing at Cornell at these bars, doing this like really tough macho dancing. And Gerard also loved dancing growing up. And so being this little set, Mary and Gerard start doing these dances in front of the Velvet Underground. And this all gets kicked off at this psychiatrist banquet that happens where Andy Warhol is invited to be a guest speaker at this like convention of psychiatrists in New York City. And he brings along the Velvet Underground as visual aid. And so what they do is Billy, the lighting designer who has already lit all these dance shows for dance companies, he designs a light show. And the Velvet Underground, they're playing their music, and Gerard and Mary are doing these like scary kind of S&M type whip dances. And the psychiatrists do not know what to do with this. They are like, what is happening? And Andy Warhol actually kind of like acts like he has no idea what they're talking about and is like, oh, sorry, I have an earache, so I can't really hear or see. That is a direct quote. He said, I can't really hear or see, as an explanation for like why he brought these crazy people to a psychiatrist banquet. So the psychiatrists think this is a disaster, but Andy thinks this is amazing. He is obsessed with this new project, and he decides to take this whole thing on the road, and he books a tour through the Midwestern United States. So Andy Warhol, Nico, the Velvet Underground, Gerard and Mary hit the road, and they go on this tour through the Midwestern United States, bringing their multimedia experience with them. And it is an absolute disaster. People in the Midwest, they do not know how to take this. They are terrified. That sounds bad. These people are scary. They're doing dances with whips. Like, what the fuck is happening? And multiple times they are run out of town by the police. So the tour goes terribly, honestly, but Andy is undeterred. And when they get back to New York City, he's like, we're gonna bring this thing to the New York people. And so they book the Dom which is this Polish community center in St. Mark's. And they come in, and Gerard and Paul Morrissey, who was a director that was working with Andy Warhol, and Billy Name, they paint the walls white at the Dom so that they can project Andy's films. And Billy does his light show, and they project Andy's films. Like, I think there's 5 films that they projected on all different walls. The band is playing, Gerard and Mary doing their dances, and Ondine and Bridget Berlin, another mole person, they sneak through the crowd, and as people are partying, they just inject unsuspecting people with speed, which is bonkers, but it's a hit. The people in New York actually get it, and they like this thing. And the event at the Dom, now dubbed the Exploding Plastic Inevitable, gets extended for 3 weeks, and it's this huge nonstop party. Walter Cronkite comes with Jackie Kennedy to kind of like see what's going on with the kids, and it's clear that something new is happening. In fact, Andy Warhol himself said about this period that we all knew something revolutionary was happening. We just felt it. Things couldn't look this strange and new without some barrier being broken. So things are very exciting. What's funny about this period is that the Velvet Underground did not really think that Gerard and Mary doing these dances was cool. They thought that it was kind of stupid, but Gerard and Mary didn't care. In fact, the Velvets, the way that the light show was developed was not to highlight the band, oddly enough. It was just to create this ambiance. In fact, I've spoken about this in the past, but this was the first time that a rock show and a light show happened at the same time. Like, this was the genesis of light shows happening at rock concerts. This was the very first time it ever happened. The Velvets were not, they were so cool. They were too cool for school, and the lights actually bothered them. And so that's why they wore sunglasses on stage, just because these lights were going crazy. And sometimes they would just turn their backs to the audience and play facing away from the audience. And so Gerard and Mary kind of become the visual focus of the Exploding Plastic Inevitable. And in order to not become monotonous, they started doing like different little scenarios and dances for each song. So for example, Heroin, the song Heroin, Gerard would like wrap up his arm and pretend to inject heroin using a ballpoint pen. And for I'm Waiting for the Man, Gerard would like sit on this crate and like lift weights and pump iron. And Mary would do like things that would complement Gerard. And so they have like these little vignettes and stories that they were like acting out, and they were all very like S&M inspired. And Mary was thin and tall and strong and dominating, and she created this rock and roll image that was like very completely unlike the like sexy go-go girls at the time. She was like really tough, and her experience dancing in bars made her very comfortable in front of a crowd. And she basically developed this dominatrix look with her whip and everything. And she says about this period, not that I knew anything about S&M, you had to go to a porno store in some grimy ghetto to find a Betty Page book, but we were the only band that said, this is sexy and hot. We were the only people saying, this is not sick, this is fun, this is good for the soul. I don't know how Gerard knew this, but he took a passive role and gave me the active role. He was always on his knees to me with his head bowed, and I was always above him. We were female and male, but I was never hanging on to him. The roles were switched. And so they developed this like super S&M rock and roll dominatrix thing going on. And this starts to really take off. And Andy decides that they're gonna go to LA. He's like very buoyed by the success at the Dom, and he's like, I know the Midwest hated me, but we're gonna take this to LA and like show them what we got. So they book a tour to LA, and right before the tour, Mary Woronov's stepdad comes to the factory to make sure that Mary's being looked after. Because again, Mary was super young. She was 19 or 20 when this was happening. And she's by far the youngest person in this particular scene. And so basically Mary's dad just wants like reassurance from Andy that he's going to be looking out for her. And Andy does not do that. He does not talk to parents. He does not take accountability. He does not do anything of the sort. And so when Mary's stepdad comes to the factory, Andy hides in the bathroom, and Gerard steps up and he's like, I will take care of Mary. I will be the man and I'll look out for her. And so they all go to LA, and they do this same Exploding Plastic Inevitable thing in LA, and it goes bad. It goes very, very bad. They do a couple shows and big famous stars are there, and Cher says, she says that, hold on, let me find the quote. She says, of the exploding plastic inevitable, quote, it will replace nothing except maybe suicide. So Cher is not impressed. No one is impressed. And to add insult to injury, their last night there, they go out to a bar after the show, and Gerard ends up getting arrested for carrying a concealed weapon because he has his whip with him. I just want to take a moment and kind of bring your attention to why the Velvet Underground was so reviled by the people in LA and kind of the rest of the country. You have to remember that in the mid-60s, we are in full-on flower power hippie mode. The hippies are like the dominant force in popular culture at this moment, and the Velvets could not be more different. The hippies are all like peace and love, and everything's colorful and everything's groovy and like just good vibes, whereas the Velvets were dark and downbeat and not about that. And so like, you know, the hippies love marijuana, they love LSD, the Velvet Underground, they love heroin and amphetamines. The hippies are like innocent and euphoric and dreaming of like communal utopia, and the factory crew was downbeat and experienced and jaded and like not about it. So the vibes are like, could not be more different. And this Velvet Underground look and sound and vibe is the beginning of rock, like hard rock, starting to be associated with evilness and the devil and the occult because of this like dark S&M thing that they had going on. And it's also very like proto-punk. In just a couple years, the Ramones and like people are gonna start playing at CBGB, and the punk movement is gonna get off the ground. And that is very, very, very influenced by Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground. So anyways, quick side note about the music side and the vibe side. But they get back to the factory after this, and Andy Warhol starts working on his new project called Chelsea Girls. And Chelsea Girls is this film that was filmed at the Chelsea Hotel. And basically this came about because Andy's current crop of superstars, Nico, Bridget Berlin, International Velvet, they all lived at the Chelsea Hotel. And we've kind of zoomed through a couple of years of the factory. Edie Sedgwick has come and gone by this point. She is no longer at the factory. And Andy Warhol had this idea of stardom as this like cyclical thing where you had Girl of the Year basically. And so this was like a nod to the disposableness of celebrities, where we have a Girl of the Year this year, and then at the end of the year we throw her away and we get a new girl, and everything is cyclical. And so Edie has been tossed aside, and we are on the lookout for the next Girl of the Year. And so they start filming Chelsea Girls at the Chelsea Hotel. And this film is really interesting because they filmed all of this footage. And it's like, basically the idea is that it's many different people living their lives at the Chelsea Hotel. And so it's like, there's no real plot. There's no plot in any Warhol film really, but it's these vignettes, different scenes of different things that are happening in different rooms at the hotel. And the film is meant to be projected side by side. So there will be like on the screen, one scene happening over here and another scene happening over here. And the idea is that you can choose what you want to pay attention to. And this is very groundbreaking and very novel and very new. So Mary like really tries hard in Chelsea Girls. She wants to be taken seriously as an actress. She's starting to actually decide that maybe she does care about something and maybe she does want to be an actress. And there actually was a script for Chelsea Girls, believe it or not. Ronald Tavel, who was a playwright who actually will go on to found the Playhouse of the Ridiculous that did a lot of work with La Mama Experimental Theater. He has written a script for Chelsea Girls, and Mary is the only person who bothered learning her lines at all. Most of it has ended up being improvised, which is the factory way, but Mary takes it seriously and she learns her lines, and her cold, sadistic portrayal of Hanoi Hannah, this dominatrix character, cements her as Warhol's next Girl of the Year. So Mary Woronov is now officially a superstar. Around the same time, Gerard and Mary, who never were actually dating, break up. And Mary starts devoting herself entirely to Ondine. Ondine, who again is gay, does not reciprocate her feelings, but he takes advantage of Mary's crush and moves in with her because, again, he's a mole person and he is homeless. So Ondine moves in with Mary and he takes all his opera records with him, and Mary gets even more involved with Speed and the Mole People. December of 1966, Chelsea Girls premieres at the Cinema Rendezvous on 57th Street in Manhattan, and it's the first underground film that's ever shown at a commercial theater. And critics tear Chelsea Girls apart. They hate it. The film in newspapers is called deviant and disturbing and a vision of hell. It is really, really terrifying to people. And the New York Times actually gave Andy this prim reprimand about his cinematic antics, and they wrote, "Now that their underground has surfaced on West 57th Street and taken over a theater with carpets, it is time for permissive adults to stop winking at their too precocious pranks." Basically saying that, like, we've had this fun with the factory and we've all been entertained by the factory, but now it's getting out of hand and, like, the adults need to step in and put an end to this because it's getting disturbing. The Chelsea Hotel actually redecorated their lobby after this film was released. They repainted it, they changed the decor, they changed the lighting. They did everything they could to kind of disassociate themselves from the Warhol crowd because they did not want people like the people portrayed in the film to start coming to the hotel. They, like, the factory people were too bad and too scary to, like, start attracting like-minded people. But to Warhol, Chelsea Girls didn't look like a horror show or a vision of hell at all. To Andy, he said, "To us it was more of a comfort. After all, we were a group of people who understood each other's problems." Around this same time, October 1966, I have to note that Valerie Solanas becomes aware of Andy Warhol because Valerie, who was also living at the Chelsea Hotel, starts seeing posters for the Exploding Plastic Inevitable, which is the whole multimedia thing that the Velvet Underground was doing. And she thinks, oh my God, there's this guy, he's producing these events. I, Valerie, have written a play. She had written this play called Up Your Ass, and she had decided that if Andy Warhol would produce her play, that would be her ticket to the big time and getting her message out there. And her message was, we have to murder all the men. That was her belief. So she's deranged, but she becomes aware of Andy Warhol and she becomes obsessed with trying to get Andy to produce her play, Up Your Ass. Early 1967, Mary has gotten the acting bug after doing her stuff in Chelsea Girls, and she decides to start participating in more plays, and she starts doing plays with Ronald Tavel and the Playhouse of the Ridiculous. And she also acquires a fan. This girl named Vera, who had been hanging around the factory, was kind of considered by everyone else around this scene as like a loser, and they didn't really like her, and she's annoying, and she starts just like being obsessed with Mary, and she goes to all of Mary's shows, and she like hangs around backstage, and she's just a super fan, and she also is like attracted to Mary and wants to be with her romantically. And Mary is not about this, and she's very annoyed by Vera, and this all culminates in Vera following Mary into the subway at 14th Street very late one night, and Mary has like hit her limit with Vera. Vera has been following her, basically stalking her for a long time now, and in kind of a drug-induced mania, putting it, I guess like that's the most polite way to put it, Vera follows Mary, who is not in her right mind really, into the subway station like 3 in the morning, 14th Street. And Mary has the idea, as the train is approaching, to get rid of the problem. And she pushes Vera onto the tracks at the subway station. And she legitimately, the train is coming, she pushes her on the tracks and she walks out of the subway station, and she, in her mind, thinks that she has killed Vera. And she feels no remorse. She doesn't feel any guilt. She feels relief that this problem has taken care of itself. And she legitimately thinks that Vera has been killed. Vera turns up later that night at Max's Kansas City, and she's not dead. She's very much alive, thankfully. She managed to escape being hit by a train. And not long after that, Vera, I think, had a medical issue and ends up leaving the factory. And so that situation resolves itself. But it does point to the fact that Mary is starting to lose it. She has been doing speed like all the mole people really, really excessively. This is also escalating with Billy as well. So in the later end of 1967, Billy starts exhibiting the same symptoms that Freddie Herco was exhibiting. Namely, he stops leaving the bathroom that he's living in at the factory, and he's making his life smaller and smaller and smaller, just like Freddie Herco. And one day, as they're in the factory, Mary and Ondine and Andy are in the factory, and Mary takes some speed that has been cut with arsenic. And she hallucinates that death is in the factory. And this is what she writes about this experience. Andy walked across the factory floor as if it didn't belong to him, as if it had a life of its own that was out of control. He joined Ondine. They were whispering about Billy. I knew Andy was afraid. Like Danny, like Eric, like Freddie, like so many others, Andy was worried that people are going to say that he kept someone buried in the wall for years on end. But I couldn't pay attention. I was sick. I lay down on the floor. Someone had cut the speed with arsenic, or maybe it was acid. I rolled over, and that's when I saw her, a large woman, dressed in endless black, sitting motionless on that cum-stained silver couch. I could smell and feel her too, a bad smell and a cold feeling, like the refrigerator door had been left open. Horrified, I saw that she had gone through Billy's carefully organized stuff, which was now scattered about the floor like bones of a recently eaten animal. She had long, horrible teeth, and she was smiling at me. I could tell she was waiting for Billy, and she didn't care if I saw her or not. She'd catch him for sure, and then what would she do? Eat him like an animal? Drag him off somewhere to the caves beneath the subway system? I climbed to my feet and stumbled over to Ondine and Warhol. I had to tell them. The factory was a trap, and we had to get out. It's death, I babbled. I just saw her sitting on the couch. We've got to get out of here before she gets us. Let him die. Ondine whirled around on me. His brown eyes had gone black with fury. Let him die? Let him die? You coward. You stole Billy's vision. Now you can choke on it. So Mary's going off the deep end, and this all culminates with her just having a meltdown at Rockefeller Center. Andy Warhol and Bridget Berlin were eating lunch at Rockefeller Center, and Bridget Berlin was ice skating, and Mary confronts them over some perceived slight that Bridget has done to her, and she's just incoherently screaming and melting down, and Andy and Bridget ignore her. They pretend they don't know her, and the attendants at Rockefeller Center drag her out and kick her out, and she ends up going back to Brooklyn where her parents live, and she collapses on the sidewalk just 3 blocks away from her parents' house. And her parents take care of her, and she gets sent to Europe, and she goes to rehab in Europe. And while she's in rehab, Valerie Solanas shoots Andy Warhol, which she survives, but that is the end of the factory scene as Mary knew it. And when she comes back from rehab in Europe, the factory is no longer really there. And I mean, it exists in its new iteration. By that point, Andy had started Interview magazine, and that is his next project. But he is not the same after getting shot. The factory is not the same. And Mary moves to LA to pursue acting. So we're gonna leave it there today. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to the end of this video, I really appreciate it. Hit subscribe, give this video a like. Both of those things help so much. And tune in next week, because next week we're gonna talk about Ondine, who is an absolutely bonkers person, a wild person, one of my favorite characters in the show. And there is very little information about Ondine on the internet at all. So he's probably someone you don't know too much about. And we're gonna talk about one of the most disturbing things in the whole factory story that ever happened, in my opinion. So it'll be an interesting video. So come back next week and we will talk about that. In the meantime, thank you again for watching. I really appreciate it. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.